Okay, so we've got this pretty fascinating cybersecurity forecast for 2025 to dig into, and it's straight from the experts over at Google Cloud Security. I'm really curious to see what they see coming down the pipeline in the next year. What are the big takeaways we should be thinking about?
Absolutely. And what I find really valuable about this report is that it's not just some like pie in the sky speculation.
Oh.
It's built on real world observations and data. They've pulled together a lot of expertise from across Google Cloud Security, like those folks at Google Threat Intelligence, Mandiant, and VirusTotal. They're the ones on the front lines, actively tracking and responding to these threats every single day.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it's less about making predictions and more about informed expectations based on what's already happening.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's dive right in. One thing that really jumped out at me is the role of artificial intelligence, or AI. And it's not just about how AI is helping the good guys, the defenders. It looks like attackers are getting their hands on these tools as well and using them in really concerning ways.
It's remarkable how quickly attackers are adopting these new technologies. The report predicts a huge surge in the use of AI, particularly large language models, by malicious actors.
Okay, for those of us who aren't like AI experts, can you remind me what a large language model is? What are we talking about here?
Sure, a large language model, or LLM, is essentially a type of AI that's really good at generating text. It can write emails, articles, even code in a way that can seem incredibly human-like. And that's where the danger lies. Imagine a phishing email that's not full of obvious typos or grammatical errors or a voice call, phishing. That sounds just like a trusted colleague.
Wow, yeah, those old tricks we used to rely on to spot a scam, like a misspelled word or something, might not work anymore.
Right, exactly. And the same goes for SMS attacks. We're going to have to be much more vigilant about, like, verifying requests through other channels and being wary of anything unexpected, even if it seems to come from someone we know.
Okay, that's pretty unsettling. So it's not just about these LLMs crafting better messages, is it? The report also talks about a rise in deepfakes being used for things like identity theft and fraud, even bypassing those KYC, those know your customer checks. That feels like a whole other level of threat.
Absolutely. It's a very concerning trend. Imagine a deepfake video that's so convincing it fools an identity verification system during a financial transaction. Or think about the potential for creating entirely fabricated identities at scale, making it even easier for attackers to slip under the radar.
Oh, wow. That's a scary thought.
Yeah. And what's even more worrying is that the report highlights how attackers are using these technologies, LLMs and deepfakes, for other, maybe less obvious purposes, like finding vulnerabilities in software, writing malicious code, and doing reconnaissance on potential targets.
So basically, it's like giving cybercriminals a powerful AI assistant to supercharge their attacks.
It's a pretty apt analogy.
Mm.
And the fact that there's a growing demand on underground forums for LLMs without any security guardrails is particularly troubling.
What does that mean, no security guardrails?
It means they want to be able to ask these AI models anything, including how to commit illegal activities, without any restrictions.
Wow. So unrestricted access to these powerful tools. No wonder the report says this is going to be a major challenge for organizations trying to defend themselves. I mean, not only are the attacks going to be more frequent, but they're also going to be harder to detect.
It's a very real concern. And it's not just about these targeted attacks on individuals or specific companies. We also have to worry about the increasing use of generative AI in what's called information operations, or I/O, by state-sponsored actors.
So I know we've talked about this before, but can you remind us what that entails?
Of course, I/O refers to coordinated efforts to influence public opinion or achieve some strategic goal, often through the use of fake social media profiles, misleading news articles, and other forms of online propaganda. And we're already seeing how AI is making these campaigns more sophisticated and harder to counter.
Right, like those fake social media profiles we've seen in the past, the ones created using those GANs, those generative adversarial networks.
Yeah, those were a big step. But now, with LLMs, we're seeing a shift towards something even more sophisticated.
Yeah.
These actors can now use AI to generate entire articles that look completely legitimate and publish them on fake websites designed to mimic real news sources.
So it's not just about creating a few fake profiles anymore. It's about building entire fake information ecosystems that are designed to deceive people on a massive scale.
Exactly. And that's a significant force multiplier. It allows them to produce and spread their narratives much more quickly and effectively. And because this content is AI generated, it can be very difficult to distinguish from genuine content, making it more likely that people will believe it.
That's really troubling. So it sounds like AI is giving attackers a lot of new tools to work with, but I'm curious, what about the defenders? What does the report say about how AI is being used to improve security?
Well, the report describes this as a second phase of AI in action with security. And it's all about leveraging AI to make our defenses more intelligent and automated. So the first phase, which we're already seeing, is about using AI to, democratize security. This means making security tools and expertise more accessible and efficient for everyone, not just large organizations with huge budgets.
So things like automating those really time-consuming tasks that security analysts have to do, like reading through mountains of threat reports or sifting through logs to find that one piece of crucial information.
Exactly. AI can help with all of that, summarizing those reports, making it easier to query and analyze large amounts of data, and even providing real-time assistance to security analysts as they work.
So freeing up those security teams to focus on the more strategic and complex tasks that require human judgment and expertise.
Precisely. But the report predicts that 2025 will see us moving into what it calls an intermediate stage of semi-autonomous security operations. And this is where things get really interesting. We're talking about security systems that are so intelligent they can handle a much wider range of tasks independently without constant human intervention.
So our systems will be able to make more decisions on their own.
Yes, but crucially, the human element will still be vital. While AI can analyze threats and take certain actions automatically, we still need human experts to make the really critical decisions, like triaging alerts and determining the best course of action for remediation. It's about finding the right balance between automation and human oversight.
Okay, that makes sense. You still need that human judgment and intuition, especially when dealing with complex and rapidly evolving threats. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the major players in the cyber threat landscape, the ones who are really driving a lot of this activity, the big four nation-state actors: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. What's the outlook for their activities in 2025? Let's start with Russia. What do the experts at Google Cloud Security see happening there?
The report suggests that the conflict in Ukraine will continue to be a major focus for Russian cyber operations. This includes cyber espionage aimed at gathering intelligence, disruptive attacks against critical infrastructure, and ongoing information operations to shape the narrative and influence public opinion.
So are we likely to see more of those big disruptive attacks like we saw earlier in the conflict, the ones that targeted Ukraine's power grid and other essential services?
It's difficult to say for certain, but the report does highlight the increasing targeting of Ukrainian soldiers' mobile devices, likely to gain tactical advantages on the battlefield. And while those large-scale attacks might be less frequent, we shouldn't rule them out entirely, and we should also expect to see the continued use of hacktivist groups, like Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, to carry out attacks and spread propaganda.
Okay, so it's still a very active and unpredictable situation, and I assume their cyber activity isn't just limited to Ukraine, right?
Absolutely not. Russia's cyber espionage efforts are global in scope, and they're very much aligned with their broader geopolitical objectives. So we should expect them to continue targeting governments, politicians, think tanks, and technology companies, particularly in Europe and NATO countries.
And what about their information operations, their efforts to shape public opinion and undermine their adversaries?
That's another area where we should expect continued activity. Pro-Russian information operations are likely to use a variety of tactics, from spreading disinformation on social media to hacking websites and leaking sensitive information, all with the goal of promoting their narratives and undermining their opponents, especially around major international events.
So a multi-pronged approach. Okay, let's move on to China. The report emphasizes their sustained investments in cyber capabilities over the past several years. What does that mean for 2025? What should we be prepared for?
Well, it means that we can expect a consistently high volume of threat activity coming from China-linked actors, and that their tactics and techniques are going to continue to evolve. The report predicts that they'll continue to rely on stealthy methods, like using operational relay box networks or ORBs. These are essentially layers of infrastructure designed to obscure the origin of their attacks, making it much harder to attribute them back to China. They're also expected to increasingly target network edge devices, like routers and firewalls, to gain an initial foothold into an organization's network. And perhaps most concerning is their focus on exploiting zero-day vulnerabilities.
Zero-day vulnerabilities, I know that's a big one. Can you just quickly remind me what those are and why they're so dangerous?
Sure. A zero-day vulnerability is a flaw in software or hardware that is unknown to the vendor, and therefore there's no patch available to fix it. This makes them incredibly valuable to attackers because they can exploit them without any fear of detection, at least until the vulnerability is discovered and a patch is released. And the fact that China-linked actors are putting so much emphasis on finding and exploiting these vulnerabilities suggests a very deliberate and strategic approach to their cyber operations.
It sounds like they're really playing the long game here.
They are. And they're not afraid to be aggressive. The report also notes their high risk tolerance. They're willing to take chances that other actors might shy away from, which makes them even more unpredictable and dangerous.
So we have to be prepared for anything, basically.
That's a good way to put it.
And what about China's information operations, particularly in the context of elections? The report specifically mentions Taiwan and the U.S. as targets.
Yes. The report predicts that pro-PRC, pro-China I.O. efforts will directly target elections and voters in both Taiwan and the U.S. And they're going to use a variety of tactics to do this, including impersonating voters online, spreading disinformation about the integrity of the voting process, even using AI-generated news anchors in videos to push their narratives. So think about those deepfakes we were talking about earlier. That's the kind of thing we could be seeing in these I.O. campaigns.
It's almost like they're trying to create an alternate reality online, one that favors their narratives and undermines trust in democratic processes.
It's a very real concern. And while their previous attempts haven't always been successful in generating widespread, authentic engagement, the report expects them to persist with these aggressive narratives and tactics.
So we need to be very aware of these efforts and make sure we're getting our information from reliable sources. Okay, let's move on to Iran. The report identifies the Israel-Hamas conflict as a likely key driver for their state-sponsored cyber activity. What are they likely to be focusing on?
As long as that conflict continues, it's going to be a primary focus for Iranian state-sponsored cyber operations. And that encompasses everything from espionage to disruptive attacks to information operations. So we're talking about a full spectrum of cyber activities.
And I assume they have their own set of longer-term strategic goals that they'll be pursuing through cyberspace as well, right?
Absolutely. The report highlights Iran's focus on maintaining regime stability, supporting their economic development, and expanding their regional influence. And these goals will continue to drive their cyber activities, even as they focus on the immediate conflict with Israel. So we should expect to see ongoing monitoring of dissidents, targeting of government and telecommunications organizations in the Middle East and North Africa, and continued involvement in cybercrime, both to generate revenue and to advance their other objectives.
So a very multifaceted approach to cyber activity. Okay, finally, let's talk about North Korea. The report notes that their cyber operations are primarily driven by geopolitical factors and their economic needs. What does that mean in practical terms for 2025?
Well, it means their cyber espionage efforts will continue, with a particular focus on government, defense, education, and think tank institutions, primarily in South Korea and the U.S., although they have shown interest in other countries as well. But one trend that's really stood out in recent years is their increasing reliance on supply chain compromises.
Supply chain compromises, we've heard a lot about those lately. Can you explain what those are and why they're so effective?
Absolutely. A supply chain compromise is essentially when an attacker targets a weak link in the software supply chain to distribute malware or gain access to a large number of victims. So instead of attacking their targets directly, they might go after a software vendor that their targets use, injecting malicious code into the software before it's distributed. And this is something North Korea has been particularly good at, targeting open source software used by developers. So it's a very efficient way to spread their malware widely.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a big concern. And of course, we can't forget about North Korea's need to generate revenue, right? They've become pretty notorious for using cybercrime to fund their regime.
Absolutely. Revenue generation is a major driver of their cyber activities. One of their key methods is employing IT workers who use stolen or fabricated identities to get jobs in software development companies, often overseas. And they're not just trying to earn a paycheck. These individuals have also been leveraging their privileged access within these organizations to carry out malicious intrusions.
Oh, wow. So they're essentially embedding their operatives within these companies.
It's a very clever tactic,
Yeah.
and it's been quite successful for them. They've also been increasingly targeting cryptocurrency exchanges, especially in the JPAC region.
JPAC, that's Japan and the Asia-Pacific region, right?
Right.
Why are they focusing on that area in particular?
It's primarily because of the high adoption rates of cryptocurrencies in those countries. They see it as a ripe target for their cybercrime operations. And we should also expect to see them continue to impersonate remote IT workers to gain access to organizations in JPAC countries. It's a tactic that's worked for them in the past, and they're likely to keep using it.
It's incredible how adaptable and resourceful these actors are. Okay, so we've covered the big four, but the report also outlines some broader global forecasts that are worth discussing. One that caught my eye was the trend of actors linked to China developing custom malware for embedded systems. Why is this such a noteworthy development?
Well, think about it this way. Traditional endpoint detection and response systems, or EDR, are becoming more and more effective at identifying and blocking threats on computers and servers. But what about all those other devices on our networks? The ones that don't always have EDR installed or where EDR isn't as mature. I'm talking about things like firewalls, VPN gateways, routers, even things like industrial control systems. Those are what we call embedded systems. And attackers are realizing that these systems are often a weak link in our defenses.
I see, so they're going after the less protected targets.
Exactly. And they're doing it with highly specialized malware that's designed to evade detection. They're leveraging the built-in functionalities of these embedded systems, often to establish stealthy backdoors and conceal their activities, making it incredibly difficult to detect them and to conduct forensic investigations after an attack.
So it's not just about protecting our computers and servers anymore. We have to think about the security of all these other devices on our networks.
Absolutely, and that's a big challenge for a lot of organizations because they might not even know what embedded systems they have on their network, let alone how to secure them properly.
Okay, that's a good point. So something to definitely be aware of. Now, of course, no cybersecurity forecast would be complete without talking about ransomware. It's been the dominant cyber threat for the past few years, and the report suggests that it's not going away anytime soon.
Unfortunately, that's the consensus. Ransomware and its close cousin, multifaceted extortion, are expected to remain a major threat in 2025.
Multifaceted extortion, that sounds even worse than just plain old ransomware. What does that involve?
Well, it's basically ransomware on steroids. In addition to encrypting an organization's data and demanding a ransom for its release, attackers are also stealing sensitive data and threatening to leak it publicly if the ransom isn't paid. And they might even threaten to launch denial-of-service attacks to cripple the organization's operations. So it's all about putting as much pressure on the victim as possible to force them to pay up.
That's a nightmare scenario. And it's not just about the financial losses, right? There's the reputational damage, the disruption to operations, and in some cases, even the potential for loss of life, like we've seen with ransomware attacks on hospitals.
Exactly. The impact of these attacks can be devastating. And it's not just limited to the initial victim. We've seen how ransomware attacks can ripple through entire supply chains, disrupting critical infrastructure and causing widespread chaos.
Okay, so ransomware and extortion are still a major threat, unfortunately. What about other types of malware? The report mentions the growing threat of info-stealer malware.
Yes, info stealers. Those nasty little programs designed to steal sensitive information like usernames, passwords, credit card details, and all that good stuff have become increasingly sophisticated. They're now using advanced anti-evasion techniques to avoid detection by security software. And the stolen credentials they harvest are often used to gain unauthorized access to organizations, leading to major data breaches.
So it's not just about stealing your credit card number anymore. These info-stealers can be used to get into your bank account, your email, your social media, even your work accounts.
Absolutely. And what makes it even worse is that these stolen credentials are readily available for sale on the dark web, making them accessible to even the least skilled attackers.
So anyone can get their hands on this stuff. And I imagine that's even more of a problem in environments where strong multi-factor authentication isn't in place.
Precisely. If you're still relying on just a username and password to protect your accounts, you're making yourself an easy target for these info stealers.
Okay, good reminder. Now, the U.S. election in 2024 was obviously a major focus of attention. What does the forecast say about cyber activity after the election? Do they expect things to calm down?
I'm afraid not. The report predicts that state-sponsored actors from China, Russia, and Iran will continue to target the U.S. government throughout 2025. And there's a possibility that they might try to exploit the transition period of a new administration, looking for any weaknesses or vulnerabilities they can exploit.
So even after the election is over, the cyber threats will persist.
Absolutely. We should expect ongoing cyber espionage activities aimed at stealing sensitive information, as well as information operations designed to sow discord and division within the U.S. And it's likely they'll use generative AI to amplify their efforts, making their campaigns even more sophisticated and harder to detect.
It sounds like we're in for a long haul here. The report also mentions the expectation of uncovering more long-term intrusion campaigns, particularly those attributed to China. What's that about?
Well, it's a reminder that these actors are playing a long game. They're not just interested in quick smash-and-grab attacks. They're patient and methodical, and they're willing to spend years, even decades, infiltrating their targets and quietly stealing information.
So we might be dealing with the fallout from intrusions that happened years ago, but we're just now discovering them.
Exactly. And that's a real challenge because it means we have to be constantly vigilant, not just about current threats, but also about threats that might have been lurking in our systems for years without our knowledge.
It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, except the haystack is constantly growing and changing.
That's a good analogy. And the report highlights another challenge that's becoming increasingly prevalent: the impact of compromised identities in hybrid IT environments.
Hybrid IT environments, that's the mix of on-premises and cloud infrastructure that so many organizations are using these days.
Right. And the problem is that user identities now span across these diverse environments, meaning a single compromised account can have far-reaching consequences.
I see. So if an attacker gets access to one of your accounts, they might be able to access your data and systems, both on your company's network and in the cloud.
Exactly. That's why the report stresses the need to move beyond just basic single-factor authentication, which is just a username and password. We need to adopt a more robust multi-criteria validation approach. So think things like phishing-resistant MFA, device verification, shorter session lifetimes, and regular risk assessments of user access.
So basically layering on as many security measures as possible to make it harder for attackers to exploit those compromised identities.
That's the idea.
Okay, that makes sense. The report also talks about the democratization of cyber capabilities, which sounds a bit ominous. What exactly does that mean?
Well, it basically means that it's becoming easier than ever for even less experienced individuals or groups to engage in malicious cyber activity. The tools and techniques that were once the exclusive domain of nation-state actors and highly skilled cybercriminals are now widely available, often for very low cost, on the dark web and other underground marketplaces. We're talking about things like sophisticated hacking tools, phishing kits, even ransomware as a service offerings.
Ransomware as a service. Wow. So basically anyone with a bit of technical know-how and a few bucks can get into the ransomware business.
Pretty much. And with the emergence of generative AI, it's becoming even easier for these less skilled actors to enhance the effectiveness of their attacks. So we're likely to see a significant increase in the number of threat actors operating in the wild. And many of them will be equipped with tools and techniques that were once considered cutting edge.
So a much more crowded and potentially more dangerous threat landscape. Not exactly comforting news.
Definitely something to be aware of.
Now, on a more positive note, the report also discusses the maturing of security operations in the cloud. What are some of the key trends they highlight in that area?
The report predicts that we'll see a much broader adoption of cloud-native SIEM solutions. Those are security information and event management systems. These systems collect and analyze security logs from various sources, and they're becoming increasingly popular because they're scalable, cost-effective, and well-suited for the cloud environment.
So they're basically the central nervous system for a security operations center, or SOC, right?
Exactly. They provide the visibility and insights that security teams need to detect and respond to threats in real time. And we're also seeing significant advancements in SOR capabilities, that's security orchestration, automation, and response. These tools are evolving beyond just basic automated playbooks to handle more complex incident response tasks, like automated malware analysis, phishing takedowns, and vulnerability patching.
So it's all about automating those routine tasks and freeing up security analysts to focus on the things that require human expertise.
Right. And we're also seeing the emergence of better tools and strategies that are specifically designed to address the unique security risks associated with cloud environments. So the good news is that our defenses are evolving along with the threat landscape.
That's encouraging to hear. Now, given the increasing reliance on cloud service providers, it's not surprising that the report predicts more regulations for these providers themselves.
Absolutely. As more and more critical infrastructure and sensitive data move to the cloud, regulatory bodies are increasingly focused on ensuring the security and resilience of these cloud environments. And that means putting more pressure on the major cloud providers like AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud to meet higher security standards.
So it's not just about organizations securing their own cloud environments anymore. It's also about holding the cloud providers accountable for the security of their platforms.
Exactly. And we can expect to see more direct regulation of these hyperscale cloud providers in 2025, with a greater emphasis on things like data protection, incident response, and transparency.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the Web3 and cryptocurrency space continues to be a hot topic, both from a technological and an investment perspective. What's the security outlook for that domain?
Well, unfortunately, the report predicts that attackers will continue to target Web3 platforms and cryptocurrency exchanges in 2025. These platforms are still relatively new, and they present a lucrative target for cybercriminals.
Yeah, we've seen some pretty high-profile heists in the cryptocurrency world in recent years, with millions of dollars being stolen.
Right, and many of these attacks have exploited vulnerabilities in smart contracts, the code that underpins many Web3 applications, or they've targeted private keys, the digital keys that are used to access cryptocurrency wallets.
So there's still a lot of work to be done to improve the security of these platforms.
Definitely. And the report highlights North Korean actors as a particular threat in this space, using social engineering tactics and supply chain attacks to target cryptocurrency exchanges and other Web3 platforms.
So something to definitely keep an eye on if you're involved in the Web3 or cryptocurrency space.
Absolutely. Another trend that the report highlights is the increasing speed at which software vulnerabilities are being exploited.
Yeah, it seems like every week there's a new vulnerability being announced, and attackers are wasting no time in exploiting them.
It's a real concern. The average time to exploit, or TTE, is shrinking rapidly, which means that organizations have less time to patch their systems before attackers start taking advantage of these vulnerabilities.
So we have to be much more proactive in our security efforts.
Exactly. We can't just sit back and wait for patches to be released. We need to be constantly scanning our systems for vulnerabilities, prioritizing those that are most likely to be exploited, and patching them as quickly as possible.
And we also need to be aware of the fact that attackers are targeting a wider range of vendors than ever before, right? It's not just about Microsoft and Adobe anymore.
That's right. Attackers are going after all sorts of software and hardware vendors, from small niche companies to large, well-known enterprises. So we need to have a comprehensive understanding of our entire attack surface, all the software and hardware that we rely on, and we need to be prepared to patch vulnerabilities in any of those systems.
Okay, so a much more complex and dynamic threat landscape than we've seen in the past. Now, the last global forecast I wanted to touch on is preparing for post-quantum cryptography. That sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, but the report suggests that it's something we need to start thinking about now.
It might sound futuristic, but the threat posed by quantum computers is very real. And while these computers are still in their early stages of development, they have the potential to break the encryption algorithms that we rely on today to secure our data and communications.
So all our passwords, our financial transactions, our sensitive communications, everything that's protected by encryption could be vulnerable to these quantum computers.
That's the concern. And that's why the report emphasizes the need to start preparing for the transition to post-quantum cryptography now, even though the threat might not be immediate. This means understanding the potential risks, planning for the adoption of new quantum-resistant algorithms, inventorying our current cryptographic usage, and staying informed about the latest developments in this rapidly evolving field.
So a lot of work to be done, even though the threat might be a few years out.
Definitely. It's a complex transition, and it's not something that can be done overnight. The sooner we start preparing, the better off we'll be.
Okay, good advice. Now, let's shift our focus to specific regions, starting with EMEA, that's Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The report highlights 2025 as a pivotal year for compliance in this region due to the implementation of NIS2. What's the big picture there?
NIS2, the Revised Network and Information Security Directive, is a major piece of legislation that will reshape cybersecurity practices across the EME region. It introduces stricter requirements for organizations to implement appropriate security measures, expands the scope of organizations that fall under the directive, and places a greater emphasis on risk management, incident response, and supply chain security.
So, a much more comprehensive and rigorous approach to cybersecurity than the previous directive.
Exactly. And we can expect to see increased regulatory oversight and enforcement, which will likely require organizations to make significant investments in training, technology, and processes to ensure they're compliant with the new requirements.
So, a lot of changes coming for organizations operating in the EMEA region, and geopolitical conflicts are also expected to continue to influence the cyber threat landscape in this region, right?
Absolutely. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine, as well as tensions in the Middle East, will continue to drive cyber threat activity in EMEA. We're likely to see more targeting of digital services and infrastructure by actors aligned with various sides in these conflicts, including hacktivist groups and state-sponsored campaigns. So organizations in this region need to be very aware of the geopolitical context and the potential for spillover effects into cyberspace.
Okay, so stay informed and be prepared for anything. And one final point for EMEA. The report emphasizes the need for more focus on cloud security in this region. Why is that such a pressing concern?
Well, it's mainly due to the rapid adoption of cloud services in EMEA, coupled with a sometimes unclear division of responsibilities for security between organizations and their cloud providers. This has led to a significant increase in investigations related to cloud security vulnerabilities, including things like misconfigurations, inadequate monitoring, credential reuse, and generally weak security practices in unmanaged cloud environments.
So it's a combination of factors. The rapid move to the cloud, a lack of clarity around security responsibilities, and a general lack of maturity in cloud security practices.
Exactly. And that's why cloud security is such a critical focus area for organizations operating in the EMEA region.
Okay, good to know. Now let's move on to the JPAC region. The report identifies North Korea as a significant threat in this region, particularly concerning cryptocurrency.
That's right. Given the high adoption rates and the significant growth of the cryptocurrency market in JPAC, we expect to see North Korean actors increasingly targeting cryptocurrency exchanges and other platforms in this region. They've already carried out several successful attacks in the past, and they're likely to continue to refine their tactics and techniques.
So they're seeing this as a lucrative target, essentially.
Exactly. And we should also expect to see them continue to impersonate remote IT workers to gain access to organizations in JPAC countries. It's a tactic that's worked for them in the past, and they're likely to keep using it.
Okay, so be wary of those unexpected IT support requests. The report also mentions Southeast Asia as a hotbed of cybercriminal innovation. What are some of the trends we're likely to see there?
Well, cybercriminals in Southeast Asia are known for their adaptability and their willingness to embrace new technologies. And the report predicts that we'll see them integrating new service-based models and emerging technologies like advanced malware, generative AI, and deepfakes into their criminal operations.
So they're basically staying ahead of the curve, adopting the latest tools and techniques to enhance their effectiveness.
Precisely. And they're also expected to establish new underground marketplaces, particularly for money laundering services, which will further facilitate their criminal activities.
So a very dynamic and evolving threat landscape in Southeast Asia.
Absolutely. And the report also highlights the ongoing use of Chinese-controlled websites that masquerade as local news outlets in this region.
Yeah, we've seen these fake news sites popping up all over the world. What's the purpose of these campaigns, and what should we be aware of?
Well, the primary goal of these campaigns is to disseminate pro-Beijing content and influence public opinion in favor of China. And while they haven't been particularly successful in generating authentic engagement so far, the report predicts that they'll continue to persist with these tactics.
So it's more about propaganda than about actually engaging with people in a meaningful way.
Right. And the biggest risk associated with these fake news sites is the potential for inadvertent amplification. If a legitimate news organization or an unsuspecting individual shares content from one of these sites, it gives that content a much wider reach and can lend it a sense of credibility that it doesn't deserve.
So we have to be very careful about where we're getting our information from.
Exactly. It's more important than ever to be media literate and to be skeptical of information that we see online, especially if it seems too good to be true or if it confirms our